Welcome to the Win Win Evangelism Podcast. I'm Tina Waldrom from Evangelism in Australia. I love helping you and your church feel confident and inspired to share Jesus consistently. Before today's topic, how to talk about Jesus with Muslim friends with Dr Richard Shumack, I want to let you know about our free download that will help you answer the hard questions that people have about faith. You can download that for free on our website, evangelisminaustralia.com. Well, today I'm chatting with Dr Richard Shumack. Richard holds a PhD in religious philosophy. He's a lecturer at Queensland Theological College and the author of Jesus Through Muslim Eyes. Also a keynote speaker at the upcoming Ideas Convention in Melbourne, Australia. Richard has actually spent many years living and working alongside Muslim communities, and it's given him a real passion for helping Christians and Muslims have honest, respectful conversations about faith and who Jesus is. So if you've ever wondered how to talk about Jesus with Muslim friends, neighbours or workmates or people at school, this conversation will really help you out. Welcome to you, Richard.
Well, thank you for having me, Tina. Good to be here.
Great to have you along. So you've spent time living among Muslim communities. Tell us a little bit about that before I dive into some deeper questions for you.
Yeah, sure. We spent many years living and working in a Somali community in Melbourne, in Australia. They were mainly refugees, and we would sort of welcome them when they arrived into Australia. We helped them in various practical ways, and we used a whole lot of different relationships and connections to try and share Jesus with them. I've also spent time living in the Muslim world, living in Egypt when I was studying, and visiting a whole lot of other ministries around the world since then as well.
Very, very interesting. So interesting, the people that come on the show and the backgrounds. So what first surprised you most about Muslims and their openness to conversations about faith?
Well, I mean, that openness is certainly unusual in Australia. Muslims are generally surprised that Christians don't want to talk more about faith and religion and God and Jesus. And they'll often read that as a half-heartedness, if you like, or Christians not taking their faith seriously. So that is one thing. Another surprising thing, I think, was that Muslims very strongly believe that Islam and Christianity are essentially the same religion, at least very, very similar, just with a few that Christians believe a few things about Jesus that they shouldn't, but aside from that, they're essentially the same. I found that surprising. There's two things, but Muslims are very easy to have a religious conversation with. If you ever, for example, you jump in a taxi with a Muslim taxi driver, you can be talking about God within 30 seconds. Easiest people in the world. Doesn't mean that the conversations are always go the way you want them to go, but it's certainly very easy to start conversations with Muslims.
Yes, absolutely. And that is very helpful to know that it's easy to have those conversations, that Muslims are open. And that has been my experience myself, particularly on an Uber drive here and there in Melbourne.
Of course.
So many Christians, Richard, feel nervous about talking with Muslims because they fear of offending them or not knowing enough. What have you learned about how to begin those conversations naturally?
Yeah, well, and this is related to what I just said before about how Muslims are very open about talking about God, and for them, God's at the center of their life. It's quite hard, I think, to offend Muslims. Muslims are not precious about faith or even about Islam, really. They're very happy for you to disagree with them. They particularly, it depends a bit too culturally where they're from, but most Muslims are very happy to have an argument with you about it. There are a few Muslims who, maybe the best way to think about it is Muslims don't like to be mocked. So, for example, many of the listeners might have heard about the cartoons that were published in Europe and the violence that led to The problem there was that Muslims felt mocked. Now, that doesn't justify the violence, but if you stay away from mocking and if you don't ridicule, then you can have very robust conversations with Muslims without any fear of them getting offended by it. But also, as with any people, Muslims are people, of course, if someone knows that you love them, then you can, that covers a multitude of offences. So you don't really need to be too worried. If they can tell that you care, then it doesn't really matter if you say everything the right way, or if you put your cup in the wrong place, or if you act in your sort of Australian culture despite being in their culture. Again, love covers a multitude of offences.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me talk to you about that concept of fear, because often in Australia, there is a fear associated with people that I talk to when we start to talk about the Muslim world. Where is the fear coming from, do you think? Why is that so prevalent in the nation of Australia? What's the narrative that's being told that's incorrect?
Well, it's not necessarily incorrect. So it's certainly true that, you just need to look at what happened in Bondi. It's true that there is a thread running through Islam, certainly running through the conservative and the technical term would be the jihadist form of Islamic theology. There's a thread that runs through which says you can use violence properly, sort of in the name of Islam. And so that's a real thing. And you see the way that the Iranian government treats its people, or you see that what happens with Hamas and the way that Hamas behaves. Islamist theologies are something that we need to recognize as being potentially violent. And that's a real thing. And so we don't want to say that those fears are unreasonable. It is reasonable to be concerned about some of the political dynamics within Islam, particularly the dominating political dynamics within Islamism. But very few ordinary Muslims buy into that theology. Be less than 1% who are willing to adopt an Islamist or jihadi Islamist theology. Even the 25% of Muslims who would like Australia to be a Muslim country, they won't use violence to try and achieve that. They'll try and do that politically. But more importantly, there's the 75% of ordinary Muslims who aren't interested in that at all and who hate that, who are also very open to having conversations. So yeah, there's a thread of Islam that politically should be taken seriously and should be resisted. But the ordinary Muslim, there's no need to be afraid of them. They are trying to live their lives. Let me just tell you a quick story. I went along once to a Muslim meeting, actually in Collingwood Town Hall, and there was an international speaker who came in and he did his talk, and then at the end, the Muslim crowd, they were nearly all Muslims, were able to ask him questions. And all the questions were along the lines of, how do I know that I'm forgiven by God? How can I stop my kids getting into drugs? How can I keep my family together? They were deeply human, ordinary, real questions. And hardly anyone was concerned about the political element of Islam. And I think that's the thing. You've got to hold in balance there's again, a small thread that's real, but most of the time, your Muslim neighbour is not out to get you. In fact, they're sitting there usually saying, why doesn't this person want to talk about Jesus with me? That's the more common situation.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. And something we don't hear, that's not what we're hearing, across our media and things like that. So it's wonderful to clarify that today. We've talked about some of the misconceptions that Christians have about Muslims. So in a nutshell, what do you think are the one or two biggest misconceptions
that Christians have about Muslims?
Muslims, yeah.
Well, I think that would be the first one we just talked about, is that Islam is out to conquer. Yeah, some are, but most Muslims are not. So that would be the first misconception. The second misconception, I think this is the it's more a misconception that Muslims have about Christianity, is that the way that Muslims think about religion is essentially legal. God is a lawgiver, and he doesn't reveal himself. In Islam, even Muhammad didn't meet God. Muhammad met an angel, because God never comes down, and God doesn't share himself with you. All he does is he gives you the rules. He gives you the law, and you're supposed to follow it. So Islam is essentially legal, and everything is thought about in terms of obedience and disobedience. And that's the conversation that Muslims will tend to want to have with you all the time. That's what they think Christianity is too. The same thing. God gave you the 10 Commandments, and you just follow them. And so I think the challenge is trying to talk about faith in a way that frames it as a personal thing, about a relationship, and about sin being relational, and about the gospel being relational, and about Jesus' sacrifice being getting us back together relationally. So it really is two very, very different mindsets about how God operates.
Yeah. And that is key, isn't it, to start to have that understanding as a believer from the very beginning, and then to be able to move from there. You often...
Right, and by the way, that's also why it probably helps you understand why the Islamist schools of thought in Islam try and impose Islam on people, is because that's what you do with laws. What you do with laws is you enforce them. Whether people like it or not, you enforce laws for their own good. They might not agree with that. They might not even think they're good, but that's what you do. And so that's what Islamic violence is usually trying to do. It's trying to enforce law on people. And in a sense, I get that. We need laws and we need them enforced. But the question is whether Islamic laws are true or not.
Yeah. Very interesting. You often, Richard, talk about Christians and Muslims talking constructively about faith. What does a constructive conversation look like in practice?
Yeah. Right. So I think two things happen. First of all, we can talk past each other, partly because of that. Muslims think they understand Christianity when often they don't. But also, there are some unhelpful topics that you can get bogged down in really quickly. And so most Muslims that you'll run into in the street or in next door neighbours, particularly in Australia, there'll be three things that they will be prepared to object to. So they'll be prepared to tell you that the Bible's been changed. They'll be prepared to tell you that the Trinity, doctrine of the Trinity, makes no sense. And they'll be prepared to tell you that Jesus never said he was the Son of God. Now, you can have conversations about that, and there are good answers to that. And I think anyone who wants to have substantial conversation with Muslims needs to be ready to say something back to that. And you don't need to do lots of study, but just tell them, why do you trust the Bible? Why do you think Jesus is the Son of God? You don't have to be an expert. You just need to, as it says in 2 Peter, give your reasons why you believe this. But I think you can get bogged down in those conversations and not move beyond that. And I think the best thing you can do with Muslims is say, yeah, I get that some of the Christian doctrines are difficult at face value to hold on to, but let me show you Jesus' story here, or let me tell you what I love about Jesus, or let me talk to you about prayer, let me talk to you about what it's like being in a Christian community. So just try and bypass conversations that won't go anywhere, and instead of talking about theology with Muslims, talk about faith and issues of faith, and ask them about their prayer life and then share about your prayer life. Ask them about whether they know that they are forgiven, that question I was talking about before. Do you know you're forgiven by God? And then talk about the experience of being a Christian and the relationship that you have with God. So again, try and bypass the theological disputes as much as possible, and talk very personally about what the experience of faith is like, and about the blessings of faith, and particularly about the hope that we have as Christians. Again, that's that relational element. If you can get there, that's really helpful.
Yeah. And I think, just having those areas of theology that you don't want to be raising straight up in a conversation, which is there's so much more that can be discussed. There's so many
Sure,
stories that you could share.
correct. And most Muslims are not taught much theology. In Islam, you do Friday school instead of Sunday school, and all you're really doing is memorizing the Quran, and you do that till you're about 12, and that's it. Very few Muslims are very well equipped to have deep theological conversations. Their faith is very practical, and that's why it's good to talk about that practical side of faith, the what it's like to walk as a Christian.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's talk about, from your own experience, what kinds of struggles or spiritual questions do you see that many Muslims are really wrestling with beneath the surface?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, this sort of goes back to the heart of Islam being about fulfilling your legal requirements, the commands that God has for you. Many Muslims feel a heaviness to that, and if you ask, well, I've asked many Muslims, and over the journey, only one Muslim has ever said to me, "Yes, I've done enough to be saved." Virtually no Muslim will say, "Yeah, I'm sure that I've done enough so that I can enter paradise." And so there's a weight that people carry, an uncertainness about whether God loves them. They may not admit this in public, but they carry that. A related element to that, and this is particularly in the case of women, is that shame is a very heavy burden for women in Islam. Many of the Christianity used to have this, but we don't so much in Australia anymore. The sense of being not just that sin makes us guilty, but that sin makes us unclean. Again, if you think about the way that Jews used to think about clean and unclean, Islam is very much like that. So many of just the ordinary things of being a woman, menstruation and childbearing, these things make you unclean. And so particularly women carry a burden of feeling unclean before God for many, many parts of their life and throughout their life as well. So wrestling with shame, wrestling with not knowing whether they've ever quite done enough, even though they might be trying really, really hard. They're some of the burdens that Muslims carry. Also, maybe let me give you another example too. I remember one of the things we did in our ministry was we took a whole lot of families on a camp at Christmas time. And there's one time we got in the bus and everyone in the bus were Muslim, but there were the Somali Muslims very conservative, and we had some Lebanese Muslims who are very liberal, very nominal. And they wanted to put music on in the bus for the drive down to the camp. And the Somalis got very angry about that. We even had literally fist fights between the women on the bus to stop playing music. Because conservative Islam says music is no good. You can't, music is disallowed. And I thought, yeah, wow, that's really sad. I thought, you're African. And deep down, they all love music. I know it because I knew all the kids, they love music. But their religion was saying, no, that's wrong. You can't express yourself through music. And there's a sadness to that. There's a diminishing of your humanity by a lot of the rules of Islam, and there's a weightiness to that. To be a really full-on Muslim is to be very serious, is to be very austere, and there's a heaviness to that, and people feel that.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, I'm just thinking of the good news of Jesus and the freedom of the gospel, such a powerful message to those Muslim people carrying those burdens that you're talking about. So just having that greater understanding of the burdens that people carry and just unpacking women, that was extremely helpful for myself. What's been the most challenging thing for you working with the Muslim community? Maybe if you can think back to when you started out, working in this space. What's been the most challenging?
I think the most challenging thing, apart from what I've just talked about, that the sort of burdens that are the weight or spiritual weight, if you like, that Muslims carry, that's a heartbreaking element to that. So that's certainly been hard. But just in terms of the dynamics of trying to share faith is that, if this is the right way of putting it, the gospel doesn't compute in Islam. And so conversations often go like this because the gospel is making promises that Muslims either don't think they need or don't think are possible. So when the gospel tells you that you are dead in your sins, Islam doesn't believe that. Islam believes, no, we're completely capable of being good if we want to be good. And so offering a salvation from our brokenness, from our essential corruption, like that makes no sense. And then the idea that Jesus will come, God in person coming to rescue us and lift us out of that situation we're in. Well, that's just impossible. God doesn't do that. God wouldn't do that. God couldn't do that. It's completely inappropriate. And so just having conversations that trying to work out, how do you get past that? How can you help Muslims not just tell them things, but help them to imagine how it might be true, developing ways of increasing their theological imaginations. That's one of the hardest things.
And I'd imagine then that's when you've talked about a lot about showing a relational faith with Christ. That's the power of it, so they can see it.
Absolutely. And it's, so one of the statistics, and you see this in the research, but as well I've seen it in real life, is that the average time for Muslims who become Christian, the average time for that to happen is about 10 years. And I think a lot of what's going on is exactly what you just said. Because Christianity and the gospel don't compute, they just need to see it lived out. They need to see grace shown to them, and bit by bit by bit, they say, oh, wow, that's what it's like. And okay, that's how... I remember one time on one of those camps, actually, I don't know how it came up, can't remember, but somewhere we were able to share Jesus saying about loving your enemies. And the Somalis we were with, they just laughed at it. They thought that was the stupidest, most ridiculous thing ever. But then over time, they saw the way that our church cared for, there was someone who was coming along who was from a drug addiction background, and they saw the way that we cared for that person, and I thought, yeah, you guys are crazy, but that's pretty amazing. And we were sort of blown away by that. And just bit by bit, brick by brick, you just sort of show them what grace looks like, and show them, prayer's another great example. When they see you pray, and Muslims pray, of course, but they pray very differently. They pray ritual prayers, they pray set prayers. But when they see people praying in the Spirit, and when they see God answering those prayers, again, it's another thing that just sort of cracks open possibilities for them about what might be, what could be real for them about the intimacy that you can have with God. So yeah, it takes that journeying with Muslims. In a sense, you are the God person for them. You're showing them what a faith person looks like in Christianity compared to what a faith person looks like in Islam.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And that statistic, 10 years. Yep, absolutely. It takes time, and it takes commitment to live out the gospel in front of Muslim people. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, Richard. I feel fully enlightened myself after this conversation and more equipped. I want to encourage you as the listener to go and get the book. Jesus Through Muslim Eyes that Richard has written. I'll drop the links in the show notes so that you can find where that book is available. Also, I want to invite you, if you're in Melbourne in August, come to the Ideas Conference at Belgrave Heights Convention Centre, where Richard will be one of the keynote speakers. It's going to be a fabulous weekend together. So, Richard, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Good to be with you, Tina.